Welcome to See This Building? There used to be shows here. In this series, I will talk about long-gone punk rock venues, or at least places where at least one or two shows happened. Of course, the title may not be totally accurate, as many of these places are either new buildings or most likely vacant lots. I'm starting with the Bernard Pub. This was the site of my first time playing a show, and of course, as many of you already know, the site of the Vice Squad raid during the Offender set in April of 1984. My first band was called White Suburban Youth. At this point, we really weren't part of the scene. We had been hanging out at New Values often, and we did know a few people from there, but that was really it. Rob Wagner and I had been going up to KCFV to hang out with Rob Mayhofer. He had a radio show there called Radio 1 Faster and Louder. It was 4 hours every Saturday night from 8 to midnight. We would bring up new hardcore stuff we had bought recently and help pick out songs. Mostly it was something to do on a Saturday night. Eventually we did the show a few times, filling in for Rob. Rob Wagner did actually cover the show himself several times through the 80s. I mentioned Rob Mayhofer because this is how he came to be on the show with the Offenders at the Bernard Pub, April 19th, 1984. Before I get into the bulk of the story, though, I will mention what I think I know about the earlier days of the Bernard Pub. From what I understand, it was a happening lunch spot with SLU employees in the 70s. The building and the pub belonged to William Pepys, a.k.a. Bill Bernard. His family had purchased the building in the 50s. He still owns the vacant lot to this day. I'll talk more about that later. What I know now, thanks to the work of Greg Kessler and his research on his archive of St. Louis punk, the first new wave act there was on July 18th, 1980, with animation and surgery. After that point, John Green was booking shows there as well as a few other places around town. And this takes me back to where I started, the first show for WSY with the Offenders. As I mentioned, Rob Wagner and I hung out at KCFV on Saturday nights. And in the first couple of months of the year, we had recorded a cassette of some songs that we would play on the air, and we had been selling copies of it at New Values as well, the local punk rock store. Rob Mayhofer decided we should finally play a show. He gave me the number of John Green, and I don't recall now if he had set it up for us to play the show or if he just gave me the number to call about getting on it. I really think it was probably the former. At this point, all we knew was roughly where it was located and that it was a rough neighborhood. The show had 3 opening bands. We ended up somehow being third out of the 4 bands that night. Also on the bill was Bulimic Skulls and Rest in Pieces, both bands made up of people I still know today. The venue was really 2 rooms. You had the bar on the left side when you walked in the door, and then a little area sectioned off in front of it by a low railing. And as you walked in, the room to the right was a back area room with a few booths, then a little hallway with the bathrooms. And then in the far right corner was the stage. Next to the stage was the swinging doors into the kitchen where bands stored gear. I'm terrible at guessing space size, but I would say capacity couldn't have been more than 100 or so, but on many nights that number was more than doubled. On this night, there was no such thing as an all-ages show. Some of the flyers actually said, "Bring your fake ID." None of us thought anything about it. We were all under 21, though. I was barely 19 myself. After the opening bands played and the Offenders had played maybe 3 or 4 songs, I saw a uniformed cop walk through the pit. I knew immediately this was not a good sign. It wasn't long after that when the power on stage was cut off, but of course the drummer kept playing. Suddenly there was not 1 but at least 4 cops in the bar. One of them announced loudly, "If you're over 21, line up here, you're leaving. If you're under 21, line up here, you're going to jail." At that point, panic ensued. People were flying out the back door or up into the second floor and out windows from there. Rob Mayhofer told me he would wait around and bail us out if we did get arrested. But that wasn't necessary, thankfully, since they said that if you were in a band, you would not be arrested. So that was the end of it. 36 kids were arrested, though. That was the end of the Bernard Pub for punk rock shows until early 1987. By that time, White Suburban Youth was no more, and Ultraman had been playing out for just about a year. We had our first show with a Boston band called Wild Stairs. It was odd being back in the room again 3 years later, and a lot more shows later for us. I don't remember there being a lot of shows there until later in the year. John Green still had other venues like Sports Palace, and a few one-off spots like Solid 50s. The first real hardcore show that I remember there that summer was in August with 7 Seconds. I think that was actually their first St. Louis show. From that point on, it was really an endless barrage of shows. So many touring bands played there in that 2-year period from 1987 through at least November 1989. Some of my favorite shows I saw there were also played on as well, of course. SNFU, 7 Seconds Twice, Ignition, Doggy Style, Verbal Abuse, Adrenaline OD, Government Issue, UK Subs a couple of times, MDC, Scream, All, Adolescence, Rollins Band. It was basically a who's who of late 80s bands that crisscrossed the country. In 1988, Bad Religion played their first St. Louis show there with L7. But there was also local shows as well. One in particular that stands out was the I-70 show put on by Jeff Kopp. He had bands from Kansas City, Columbia, and, of course, St. Louis. While John Green was the primary promoter, there was also a couple of other groups of people that booked shows on a regular basis as well as a few one-off people. Of the two other promoters that did more shows than just a handful, there was Leaping Lizard and Breakfast Beverages. Leaping Lizard was two people, Susie Hopper and Matt Lauber. Breakfast Beverages was run by two high school girls, actually, Kathy Bauer and Roberta Moore. They were responsible for bringing Fugazi to the Bernard Pub for their first St. Louis show. This one and the Rollins Band show the year before in 1988 had to be two of the most packed and hottest shows ever. It was so hot during Rollins Band that he actually stopped mid-set and told everyone to go outside to cool off before completing it. And as it could also be super hot, it would be super cold during the winter. The heat was generated from one of those gas heaters that hung from the ceiling, and Bill Bernard was loath to turn it on most nights. If the heat and cold wasn't enough, when you got home from the show, your nose was basically just full of black junk. I don't even want to think about what was in that room. I do know that it was slightly improved when the carpet in front of the stage finally disintegrated into nothing. I guess that is actually what we had all been breathing. Carpet. Not only did John Green book most of the shows there, but he also ran the bar as well as for the most part. Bill Bernard would be there too, but mostly he just sort of floated around the room. He was sometimes playing security. If you didn't behave, you might have found yourself a 14-year-old kid in the penalty box near the front door in a timeout. John Green would buy 2-liter bottles of Vess or an even cheaper knockoff soda to sell for $1 a cup, which I don't even think were 16-ounce cups. I think they were actually Dixie cups. As I mentioned earlier, the neighborhood was a bit rough. It was not unusual for cars to be broken into during shows, and if you were really unlucky, you could get mugged. The other memorable detail that anyone that was there talks about was the groups of small children that would swarm the parking lot as soon as people arrived, offering to rap for a quarter, and there was even one kid that would do backflips for a quarter. But overall, as long as you stayed near the building and didn't go anywhere near the block behind, you were actually relatively safe. The last time I remember being at the Bernard Pub was in November of 1989. Ultraman had been home from tour for a couple of months, and at that point, we did a headlining show there. In the back of the room was an old jukebox that I have to say now I don't think I ever noticed until that night. For whatever dumb reason, a fight broke out among some skinheads, and the jukebox took the brunt of it. This pretty much ended the set, as Bill Bernard became quite upset about this. By the early part of 1990, John Green had been looking for new places and started doing shows there instead of the Bernard. It would make the news 2 more times before its ultimate demise. First, in May of 1990, a woman was brutally murdered in one of the apartments upstairs. She had been strangled with an extension cord, and then from what I remember being told, they had used a broken bottle to try and sever her head. It was pretty gruesome. It sat empty and boarded up from that point on until early 1994. At that time, I was in a band called The Aggravations. We were at practice, and while we were mid-song, I noticed on the TV in the corner that there was a news story about a plane crash, and the building looked very familiar. I told them to stop so I could hear the TV. Sure enough, it was the Bernard Pub. A small single-engine plane from the nearby flight school had made an emergency landing, attempted to land on the interstate, but instead landed on the building. That was too much for it. It had to be raised. For such a small little corner bar on the south side of St. Louis, it sure made the news a lot. But this was not the last time it would make the news. As I said, Bill Bernard still owns the lot where it stood and the parking lot across the street. In 2006 or so, a local developer built a subdivision behind where the Bernards stood. They wanted his lots, but he refused to sell. They had been in his family for decades, and he had trees that he had planted in the 70s that he lost to the developer that got a little aggressive, or at least the people clearing the lots and not paying attention. He was, of course, outraged by this and hired a slew of lawyers to go after them. I got this information directly from Bill Bernard when I stopped to talk to him around that time. He was cutting the grass on the lots with a push mower. That's how you have money for lawyers. You cut your own grass. In the description, I'll include links to some shows at the Bernard, as well as the link to the article from the 2006 about his lawsuit. You will also find links to flyers and to the archive of St. Louis Punk for more information. I have plans to do these as often as possible. I'm hoping once a week isn't too ambitious. If you have a favorite venue you would like to hear me ramble about, let me know in the comments or message me. And of course, please add your stories to the comments about the Bernard Pub. And as is the custom here on the YouTube, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button. Thank you.